Law, child, come on in here and sit a spell. I was just getting started on peeling this here bucket of apples and was hoping somebody would drop by so I'd have me somebody to talk to. Granny Tollett smiled at me and tossed one of the apple peelings to a rooster who was patiently waiting in the yard just off the porch. I loved to drop by Granny's house on a Saturday morning. She'd always have some treat for me and, of course, a new story to tell. Just then, she started out. Did I ever tell you about the time we got the new organ at church? I was just thinking about that time us women got together and got an organ for Harmony Chapel Church. Now, it wasn't any light matter, though. Besides the money, it took us nearly 3 years to raise it, and there was so much opposition. Come to think of it, we raised more opposition than we did money. Granny Tollett laughed and tossed another peeling to the yellow rooster. An organ in them days, honey, was just a wedge to split the church in half. It was the new carpet that I told you about before that bought the organ. You know how it is. You get yourself a new dress, and then you gotta have a new bonnet. And then you can't wear your old shoes and gloves with a new dress and a new bonnet. And the first thing you know, you've spent 5 times as much as you set out to spend. And that's the way it was with us with the carpet and the organ, and the pulpit chairs, and the communion set. Most of the men folks were against getting the organ from the start, and Silas Petty was the foremost. Silas made it a point of going against everything that women favored. Sally Ann used to say that if a woman would come up to him and say, "Let's go to heaven," Silas would start off towards the other place at once. He was just that mullish and contrary. And Job Taylor always stood up for Silas, so he didn't want it either. Of course, Uncle Jim Matthews didn't want the organ. He was afraid it might interfere with his singing. And Parson Page, he never opened his mouth one way or the other. He was one of those men that tried to sit on both sides of the fence at once. And he had sat that way for so long, he was mighty good at balancing himself. Us women, on the other hand, we didn't say much, but we had made up our mind to get that organ. So we went to work in our women's ministry. And in less than 3 years, we had enough money for it. I've often wondered how many pounds of butter and how many baskets of eggs it took to raise that money. I reckon if they'd been piled on top of each other, they'd have reached plumb to the top of the steeple. You know, the women of Israel brought their earrings and their bracelets to help build the tabernacle. But we just had our egg and butter money. Anyhow, we finally raised enough money, and us women went and bought it. It came down from Louisville. Your papaw went to town to get it with his 2-horse wagon, and he brought it out and set it up in our parlor. And I tell you, we had a right good choir back in those days. The only trouble was that everybody wanted to be the leader, and that's a common falling out with church choirs. Billy Amos sung soprano, and Miss Penelope was the alto. John Petty sung bass, and young Sam Crawford was tenor. As for Uncle Jim Matthews, well, he sung everything, and plenty of it too. Miley Amos used to say he was worse than a flea. He'd start out on the bass, and the first thing you knew, he'd be singing tenor with Sam Crawford. And by the time Sam was good and mad, he'd be off to the alto or the soprano. He was one of those meddlesome old creatures who thinks the world never moved till they got into it, and they got to help everybody out with whatever they happen to be doing. Now, I know you've heard of children being born kicking. Well, Uncle Jim, he must have been born singing. I've seen people who said they didn't like the idea of going to heaven and standing around a throne and singing hymns forever and ever. But you couldn't have pleased Uncle Jim any better than to set him down in just that sort of heaven. Because whenever there was a chance to do some singing, you'd be sure to find Uncle Jim. Folks used to say he enjoyed a funeral a heap better than he did a wedding. Because he could sing at a funeral, but he couldn't at a wedding. And Sam Crawford said he believed if Gabriel was to come down and blow his trumpet, Uncle Jim would get up and begin to sing. Now, it wouldn't have been so bad if he had any sort of a voice, but he had been singing his whole life and hollering at protracted meetings ever since he got religion, till he had plumb sung and hollered all the music right out of his voice. And there wasn't much left but the old creaking machinery. He used to remind me of one of those old rickety houses with the blinds flapping in the wind. Oh, it mortified us terribly at the thought of the Methodists or the Baptists coming to our church. Us Presbyterians were sort of used to the old man's hollering, but people that wasn't, they couldn't keep a straight face when the singing began. And it took more grace than any of us had to keep from getting mad when we seen people from another church laughing at our choir. The old man was a good enough Christian, I reckon, but when it came to singing, he was a stumbling block and a rock of offense to the whole church, and especially the choir. The first thing Sally Ann said when she looked at that new organ was, "Well, Miss Tollett, do you reckon it's going to sound good with Uncle Jim's voice?" And I laughed till I had to sit down in a chair. Well, anyhow, when the men folks found out that our organ had come, they began to wake up, I tell you. Your papaw brought it out that Tuesday. And Wednesday night, as soon as the prayer meeting broke, Parson Page said, "Brethren, there's a little business to be transacted. Please remain a few minutes longer." Once we had all sat back down again, he went on to say that the sisters had raised some money and bought an organ, and that there was some division of opinion among the brethren about using it. So he said he wanted to have the matter discussed. And as soon as he started using a lot of big words and smooth talking, I knew there was trouble ahead for us women. Uncle Jim was the first one to speak. He was so anxious to begin, he could hardly wait for Parson Page to stop. And anybody who heard him would have thought that he'd been up to heaven and talked with the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost and all the angels. To hear him talk about the sort of music that was in heaven and the sort that there ought to be here on earth. "My brethren," he said, "when John saw the heavens open, there wasn't no organs up there. Now God don't care nothing about this newfangled worldly instruments, but when a lot of sweet human voices get together and praising him, why, the very angels stop singing to listen." Miley Amos was right behind me, and she leaned over and said, "Well, if the angels rather hear Uncle Jim singing than our organ, they've got mighty poor taste." And that's all I've got to say. Silas Petty was the next one to get up. "I never was in favor of doing things halfway, brethren. And if we've got to have that organ, why, we might as well have a piano too, and be done with it. Me, for my part, I want to worship the good old-fashioned way that my fathers and my grandfathers worshipped in. And unless my feelings change very considerably, I'm going to have to withdraw from this church if y'all bring in Satan's music box and set it up in this holy place." Sally Ann turned around and she whispered to me, "Well, if that's the case, we ought to got that organ long ago." And I liked to laugh right out. I leaned over and I said, "Well, Sally Ann, why don't you get up and talk for us?" And she said, "Well, the Spirit ain't moved me yet. I reckon it's too busy moving Uncle Jim and Silas Petty." Just then I looked around, and there was Abram standing up. Now I reckon you could have knocked me over with a feather. You see, Abram was one of those close-mouthed men. He never spoke if he could get around it in any way whatsoever. Parson Page used to get after him at every meeting for not leading in the prayer or having family worship. But the Spirit moved him that time for sure, and he was talking as glib as Uncle Jim, and he said, "Brethren, I'm not caring much one way or the other about this organ. I don't know how the angels in heaven feel about it, since I don't have as much acquaintance with them as the other men in here do. But I do know enough about women to know there ain't any use trying to stop them when they get their heads set on a thing. So I'm going to haul that organ over here tomorrow morning and set it up for the choir to practice on Friday night. And I reckon for sure all the men in here are lined up against me in this matter. But then again, I've got all the women on my side. And I reckon all the women and one man makes a pretty good majority. So I'm going to haul that organ over here tomorrow morning." I tell you, I felt right proud of Abram. Just then, Parson Page got up. "Well, it seems to me there's some sound sense in what Brother Parrish says. So I suggest that we let the sisters have their way and give this organ a trial. And if we find that it's hurtful in the interest of the church, it'll be an easy matter to remove it." Just then, Miley Amos said to me, "They'll be working to get that organ out of here the very moment we get it in." Anyways, the choir met Friday night. Millie came in a flurry and she said, "I hear all the Baptists are coming to our church on Sunday, and I want to show them what good music is this once anyhow. And even better, I hear Uncle Jim Matthews is laid up with rheumatism, and if that ain't a sign, I never saw one." Just then, Sam Crawford slapped his knee and said, "Well, if the old man's rheumatism just holds out over Sunday, them Baptists will hear a good singing for sure." Millie went on to tell that she'd been up to Miss Penelope's, who'd been taking lessons from her niece from Louisville all summer long. And the way Waggin' Tongues told it, she was getting pretty good at it. She sent word that she wanted to sing a voluntary on Sunday. A voluntary? What's that? Sam asked. Why, it's a hymn that somebody sings of their own accord without the preacher giving it out. You know, just like your tomatoes come up in the spring. Voluntary, without you planting the seed. That's the way they do it in them city churches. And we're going to put it on city style Sunday. Everybody got busy and got to work. Heck, we even practiced some new tunes and hymns, just in case Uncle Jim's rheumatism didn't hold out. He'd still have to hold his peace and couldn't ruin the singing. Well, Sunday came, and wouldn't you know it, the first person to walk through the door was Uncle Jim. And there he was, smiling like a basket of chips, even if he did have to walk with a cane. We'd had the church cleaned up just as neat as a new pin. Mary Jane had put a bunch of honeysuckles and pink flowers on the organ, and everybody was dressed to their best. Miss Penelope was sitting at the organ with a bunch of roses in her hands, and the window was all open, and you could see the trees a-waving in the wind and hear the birds singing outside. I always did think that was the best part of Sunday, just before church begins. In that moment, Granny Tollett's voice dropped. Her words came slowly, and the story fell into one of those flashes of silence. I noticed that she had stopped peeling the apple that was in her hand, and she sat motionless, looking far off. No mind reader's art was needed to tell what scene lay faded before her eyes. I knew that in her mind there was that old church with its battered furniture and a high pulpit. For one brief moment, the graveyard had yielded all the loved ones that had went before her, even Papa, who she missed so dearly. And there they were, all the familiar faces, looking out from every pew. Granny was completely silent, except for the breeze that fanned across her brow. But this wasn't the breeze that I felt as I sat next to her. For her, I knew the wind was blowing across the plains of her memory, and the honeysuckle odor that it carried wasn't from the bush in the yard. There was a bobwhite calling in the meadow across the dusty road, and in her mind, she and Papa were side by side in their accustomed place, and life laid like a watered garden in the peaceful stillness of the time just before the church would start. The apple slipped from her fingers back into the bucket, and Granny Tollett came back to the here and now. Sakes alive! I must be getting old, I declare. I clean forgot what I was saying. You were at church, Granny, I whispered as I tenderly put my hand on her arm, and the singing was about to begin. Sure enough it was. Well, all at once, Miss Penelope laid her hands on the keys, and she began to play and sing Nearer, My God, to Thee.
Nearer, my God, to Thee. Nearer to Thee. Even though it be a cross that raiseth me.
We'd heard that hymn all our lives in church, in protracted meetings and prayer meetings, but we didn't know how it could sound till Miss Penelope sung it all by herself that day with our new organ. I recollect just how she looked. Oh, she was a pretty little thing, and sometimes I can hear her voice just as plain as I hear that robin out yonder in that elm tree. Every word was like a bright new piece of silver, and every note was just like gold. And she was looking up through the window at the trees and the sky like she was singing to somebody we couldn't see. I clean forgot about the new organ and the Baptist. I really believe she was feeling nearer to God than we'd ever felt before. And when she got through with the first verse, she played something soft and sweet and begun again. And right in the middle of the first line, I declare, even though it's been 25 years ago, but I get mad now just thinking about it. Right in the middle of the first line, Uncle Jim joined in like an old squawking jaybird.
Darkness be over me, my rest is a stone.
And sung like he was trying to drown out Miss Penelope and the new organ too. Everybody in the church jumped when he first started. He'd got nearly through the first verse before everybody could take in what was happening. Even the Baptist looked just as surprised as the rest of us. But when Miss Penelope begun the third verse, and Uncle Jim joined in with his hollering, I saw old Bush Elroy grin. And that grin spread all over the Baptist crowd in no time. The Presbyterian young folks were giggling behind their fans, and Bush got to laugh until he had to get up and walk out of the church. They said he went up the road to the pasture and laid down on the ground and rolled over and over, laughing so hard till he couldn't laugh anymore. I was so mad I started to get up, and goodness knows what I'd have done. But your papa grabbed my dress and said, "Steady," just like he was talking to the old mare. The thing that made me the maddest was Silas Petty, a-leaning back in his pew and smiling as satisfied as he'd seen the salvation of the Lord. I didn't mind the Baptist half as much as I did Silas. The only person in the church that wasn't the least bit flustered was Miss Penelope. I always said that nobody but a born lady could have acted the way she did. She sung right on as if everything was going right to plan, and like she'd been singing hymns with Uncle Jim all her life. 2 or 3 times when the old man lagged behind, it looked like she waited for him to catch up. And when she got through and Uncle Jim was lumbering on the last note, she folded her hands and sat there looking out the window where the sun was shining on those silver poplar trees, just as peaceful as an angel, while the rest of us was mad as hornets. The only other person in the church that wasn't flustered was Uncle Jim. That old creature was just as simple-minded, and he didn't know he had done anything out of the way. He sat there looking just as pleased as a child, and thinking, I reckon, how smart he had been to help Miss Penelope out with the singing. Well, anyhow, the rest of the hymns went off without a hitch, since they were all new songs that Uncle Jim didn't know, and it did me good to see Uncle Jim's face when they struck up those new tunes. He tried to join in, but he had to give it up and just sit and listen for once. Parson Page preached a powerful, good sermon, but I don't reckon it did much of us any good. We was so put out about Uncle Jim spoiling the new organ's first church service. Of course, the choir was madder than ever at Uncle Jim, and when Miley Amos had the fever that summer, she called me over to her bedside, the day that she was at her worst, and she pulled my head down, and she whispered to me, just as feeble as a baby, Don't let Uncle Jim sing at my funeral, Miss Tollett. I'll rise up out of my coffin if he does." And I broke out a-laughing and a-crying at the same time. The bucket of apples were all peeled, and the rooster's belly was full. Granny Tollett leaned over to me. "J.D., for a young boy, you're such a good listener. Most folks can't sit still long enough to listen nowadays to an old woman talk about days gone by. Be sure to come see me next Saturday, and I'll tell you another story." "I will, Granny. I'll see you then."